Okay, so maybe we can start. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
So, I'm Ivan Lopez Munuera and Andrea Bagnato. We are going to do two separate presentations that are actually sharing one common point, and it's the architecture of the epidemics, and especially how architecture was shaping HIV/AIDS. First in the 80s, and then afterwards, actually in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, with two very different geographies. So maybe I will start. You have to think that HIV/AIDS happened not only in the human bodies, let's say, but also in some of the architectures where the HIV/AIDS was taking form in a way or taking shape. And there were like very specific places, especially in New York, where one of the first locations where HIV/AIDS was located in the early 80s, when this epidemic was actually face a lot of contestation from very specific kind of groups that were formed in a very specific kind of architecture. That is what I call discotecture, and is the architecture of nightclubs. So in 1978, New York was in crisis. The large factories which at one time formed part of the landscape of Manhattan lay abandoned. The scenery was desolate, a scary place, yet suggestive to live in. The New York Daily News published its infamous cover with the sentence, "Drop dead," a phrase attributed to President Gerald Ford, who he declared that he could veto any bill calling for a federal bailout of New York City, and who instead proposed legislation that could make it easier for the city to go into bankruptcy. Yet, the city's crisis also had an unexpected effect. It allowed spaces where music, architecture, politics, and art mingled and emerged. Urban decay provoked a drop in rents and gave an opportunity for those linked to the music, design, architecture, and art scenes to inhabit the large spaces of lower Manhattan with minimal rents, as we can see, for example, in the famous photographs of Thomas Truth in Soho, in New York. The urban environment of New York during this time was materialized as a stage that came to be known as Soho, Tribeca, and Alphabet City, where theatrical and living and gallery space merged, and enigmatic psychodramas were enacted in the streets. Below 14th Street, New York was an unknown territory known as the Wastelands. Space there was abundant and relatively cheap, given the availability of former industrial spaces, which became the loft movement, for living, producing, and exhibiting. From their very beginning, all of these actions converged in a continuous performance where daily life was considered a prolongation of artistic intentions and vice versa. These new spaces included the Electric Circus, where the Velvet Underground staged a revolution, 80 Wooster Street, where Richard Foreman gave his first performances of ontological hysteric theater, the House of Jack Smith rebaptized the Plaster Foundation of Atlantis, an incubator for the majority of films by Smith and others like Ramchumlum and the components of Cinema Grotesque. The Mad Club converted into a meeting point where performances gave way to concerts, or the Palladium, a place that came to mark the end of an era. These were joined by the well-known CBGB and Max Kansas Cities, the various factory spaces of Andy Warhol, where the whole world could be a star, as well as a multitude of loft spaces, units and rooms hijacked for creative ends. These sites were host to different kinds of happenings and events that blurred disciplinary boundaries and identities between gig and performance, theater and exhibition space, and between artists, performers, spectators, and activists. Amongst them, certain aesthetic components based on the provisional, on recycling, or the unfinished were repeating elements, indicative of the haphazard and temporary nature of the spaces that housed them. This was a game-changing situation in architecture and design, As Nancy Foote explained in her revelatory 1976 article, The Apotheosis of the Crummy Space. These places were not only important because of the redefined beauty found in their industrial decay, pitted floors, crumbling plaster, exposed pipes, embossed in ceilings, but also because of the freedom they gave one to interact with a narrative embedded in architecture. For example, here we can see what it was MoMA PS1, or what it is going to be MoMA PS1. Amidst this landscape, nightclubs and discos became the epicenter of an architectural revolution. This is a map that I contributed to do for the Vitra Museum exhibition Night Fever on the design of some of these nightclubs. And you can see that most of them were in the lower part of Manhattan, or at least in below Central Park. They included the Palladium, a dance club designed by Arata Isozaki in New York and described as an urban apocalypse, in keeping with its city's decayed status. Located on 14th Street, the building's history as a movie palace, concert hall, and club is lengthy, dating back to 1926, when the structure was built as a movie theater. Its incarnation as a nightclub lasted from 1985 to 1997, a short time for architecture, but a good life for nightclubs. In that time, the Palladium came to define an epoch. It contained, shaped, and propagated a very specific architecture, one that I call discotecture, the architecture of the disco, understanding the architecture of these nightclubs as more than just spatial configurations, but as the creation of an event that enacts the politics and social constructions of the period relating to architecture and urban planning. Discotecture is a continuous performance and a collection of assemblages that renders visibility in the construction of bodies, technologies, media, and environmental ideas. In the interaction between designers and citizens, DJs and dancers, technologies and regulations, architecture plays a fundamental part. The Palladium's architecture shows that what happened in New York's nightclubs had a series of wide-ranging ramifications throughout the city that proliferated in all directions and generated instability, emancipation, and dissidence in the street, homes, town hall, and governmental decisions. The Palladium started life as the Academy of Music, a movie theater designed by William Fried, located in front of an opera house with the same name. Like many other cinemas at that time, its architecture resembled the Beaux-Arts opera houses of the 19th century. Frescoes and moldings decorated the vaults and domes of the main room, supported by rows of Corinthian columns. From the beginning, it was considered a prime example of the cinematic spaces created in New York in the 20s and 30s, where the powerful combination of architectural and electrical control over sound and image represented the culmination of the modern soundscape, an architectural artifact where space, sound, and lighting were unified. This idea continued even after the building's transfiguration into other uses. The building operated as a movie theater until the early 70s. Beginning in the 60s, the theater was also used as a rock concert venue, where bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Blondie, and the Clash performed. Here you can see Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones performing there, many different tickets, or of course the entrance. The theater was rechristened as the Palladium on September 18, 1976, with a live radio broadcast by the band. In the early 80s, the building was bought by Steve Rubel and Ian Schreger with the intention of turning it into a club. Rubel and Schreger were two former college friends, a restaurateur and a lawyer respectively, and they became club promoters, most famously as the owners and operators of Studio 54, an adventure that lasted for 20 wild months. At Studio 54, they rehearsed the idea of having a nightclub inside of a theater, an extremely powerful image that related to the cheap and abundant spaces available in the post-industrialized city. The theatrical context suited Rubel and Schweger's belief that nightclubs offer a certain kind of atmosphere or scenography, an arena for a new community to perform, the dancers, who came night after night to the club. In discos and clubs, everything is a stage. There are no distinctions between the DJ and the public, interacting through the steps and the music, asking for more rhythm and having it in response, who together construct an agent, the dancer, who agglutinated these conceptions in their body, in his, her, or their bodies. If the dancer was the main star, the velvet rope was their new architectural device. During Studio 54 opening, Rubel and Schweger decided for the first time to install a velvet rope, an architectural device that created expectation and attracted a new kind of people, who waited to enter the club while being photographed and stalked by a curious crowd. The rope perfectly symbolized the venue's exclusionary door policy. Bianca Jagger, Brooke Shields, Bianca Jagger celebrating her birthday in a white horse inside the Studio 54, Brooke Shields, Halston, Liza Minnelli, and Andy Warhol queued together with other dancers and curious people, all trying to get inside and not all succeeding. For example, it was very famous that Frank Sinatra tried to get in, but he was not cool enough to get into the club. All in the glare of the flashes of photographers ready to capture a moment and then publish it in a magazine or a newspaper. There were other attractions for the assembled media. Studio 54 and then the Palladium challenged the morals of the time with their widely publicized sex scenes in VIP spaces and on the dance floor, as well as the drug use that was experienced inside. The chemical regime tested here was part of the atmosphere, as Nicky Ciano, a DJ at the gallery and in Studio 54, confessed. Douglas Crimp remembered that without drugs, disco can be fun, but only just fun. Cocaine and amphetamines were part of the everyday cocktail at Studio 54 and the Palladium, increasing the body's temperature in concert with the dancing, which heated the environment in turn. Of course, the pet of Studio 54 that was hanging in the dance floor was this moon snorting a full spoon of magic. This is why most of the outfits worn there were summery, even during the winter. Tank tops, bare chests, and sweaty bodies abounded in every picture of Studio 54 and the Palladium. Witnesses claimed that the air conditioning and refrigeration systems were not used often. And maybe they were right. Less than a year and a half after Studio 54's opening, the FBI discovered garbage bags stuffed with $800,000 in cash hidden in the ceilings and air conditioning systems in the basement. Steve Rubel and Ian Schweger closed Studio 54 and went to prison for tax evasion, spending 15 months at a minimum security prison in Montgomery, Alabama. Here is Ray Cohn, his a lawyer, and that it is going to become Donald Trump's lawyer. Until they were released on the morning of January 13th in 1981. After their release, they decided to create a new nightclub, the Palladium. According to Richard Mayer, after the pair were released from prison, nobody in New York wanted to work for them, which may have been one reason for Schweger and Rubel to commission an architect from a country as far away as Japan. But this was not the only reason, of course, to hire Isozaki. It could seem that the Japanese architect was an obvious choice. Schweger wanted to be part of the art world. He said, artists are the rock stars of the 80s. And Isozaki had recently been appointed architect of the new Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. These are his famous silk screens for the competition, which follow previous commissions for museums like the Museum of Modern Art in Gunma in 1974. For this latter building, he proposed a strategy that he later adapted to the Palladium, a form that is a conceptual statement about the museum as void and frame. Using a 12-meter cube as a metaphorical form to express a frame, Isozaki turned the museum into a stage, and a container for displaying and isolating artwork. This grid of cubes, inspired by Sol Levitt, became the central element in the Palladium's transformation. Although largely absent from writings on Isozaki, the Palladium was one of his most significant projects, a laboratory for some of his most significant ideas, specifically those related to the creation of a technological environment, a space that could gather together different ranges of technologies and the exhibition space. Isozaki was first known, of course, as an architect related to Japanese metabolism, although he always claimed, even nowadays, that he was not part of that movement. This movement, in its manifesto published in 1960, proposed the production of buildings and cities as analogous to natural cycles of growth, decay, and regeneration, entailing the constant replacement of parts. They said, "We regard human society as a vital process, a continuous development from atom to nebula." For Isozaki, the lack of irony in some of the metabolist projects was his reason for feeling separate from the movement. He was more closely aligned with artistic groups like the Japanese neo-Dadaists. But although Isozaki rejected his inclusion in the metabolist movement, he was part of its milieu, especially during his years working at the office of Kenzo Tange during the 60s. In 1970, Tange asked Isozaki to design an intervention for the Festival Plaza in the International Exhibition Osaka 70, conceived of as an international event to celebrate Japan's rapid economic growth during the previous decade. Isozaki decided to create a robot-activated cybernetic environment. Light, sound, smoke, and bubbles pour forth from large tubes on its sides, according to Paul's instructions. This is an unseen video that Isozaki gave it to me. I think that it was like really fantastic because even though it was like this kind of futuristic idea of technology, actually they didn't develop the technology necessary to move all of these elements, so it was full of people that were like step by step moving it. A mobile sub-control station activated lights, sound, and trolley equipment. This idea was foundational in the design of the Palladium, at least in its early sketches, especially in the configuration of a central element that ultimately was not produced. A gigantic chandelier 3 times the size of a human being that was to hang in the middle of the dance floor. If Isozaki's robot could be seen as the optimistic face of technology, a celebratory cyber representation of the economic growth of post-war Japan, then an earlier work of his, The Electric Labyrinth and the 14th Milano Triennale, could be interpreted as the dark side of the same phenomenon. He described his intervention in the following terms. My project used light, projection, sound, and music to involve the visitor in a technologically created environment. In the display, ghost figures from the Edo period of Japanese history overlap with the ruins of Hiroshima and the destruction of the city of the future in what amounted to a criticism of modern urban planning for doing no more than painting rosy utopian pictures. This project and its description shows that Isozaki was never part of the metabolist optimistic point of view on technology. He was instead always skeptical of their utopia. For Isozaki, the dark side of technology was central to the configuration of the Palladium's architecture. In this specific project, there was neither an embrace nor a rejection of technology. Rather, technology was imagined as a space of possibilities. With this background and these 2 fields of experimentations, the ideas on technology and art spaces, the Palladium's transformation habilitated a hybrid space for testing the possibilities of an environment. For the Palladium, Isozaki decided to intervene only in the interior. From the outside, one would never guess the extent of the transformation achieved within. Isozaki's addition is itself an enormous stage set that has moved out of the traditional confines of the stage to modulate and animate the existing ornament, as well as the undulated dancers and spectators in the auditorium proper. The new high-tech double staircase, whose floor is 2,400,000 round lights set in glass blocks, is wondrous to behold, it was said during the opening. At 8 p.m. on May 14, 1985, security men in coats and ties admitted the first people through the velvet ropes in front of the Palladium. A silver cubic framework rising 65 feet was dropped into the crumbling shell of the theater at its lodge level. This framework was described by Isozaki in the following terms. Making multidimensional spaces from concrete objects necessitates basic lines and compositional units to serve as minimal clues. The device that I ultimately hit on was the use of a grid composed of homogeneous, limitless square compartments to cover exterior surfaces. My entire visible world, he told me, was to be covered with this grid of equal squares. The lighting system was integral to the architecture. It was designed by Fisherman and Stone, that are going to design, for example, the Kennedy Space Center or the World Trade Center Memorial. And this firm also designed the dance floor concept, which was framed by two 25-screen video arrays, on which artists like Nam June Paik or Laurie Anderson show video works. Although now ubiquitous, these were the first ever to be conceived and built. Fisherman and Stone worked very closely with Isozaki. They rented one room in their New York office to the Japanese architect in order to have a permanent location in the city where Isozaki's team could work. A system of Barry lights was installed in the grid, which produced 60 color tones in 1/4 of a second. The sound system, produced by Richard Long Associates, was described as a unique beast. The relationship between sound and lighting system in the creation of a new kind of architecture, the discotecture, can be traced back to the 60s, when the electric circus opened its doors. This is a drawing by Ingrid Superstar of the electric circus, the Dome, and you could see, of course, Andy Warhol, John Cale, Lou Reed, that are also there in the stairs of the electric circus. Located in St. Mark's Place in New York, the former Polish National Home was turned into the Dome restaurant, and in 1966 was sublet by Andy Warhol and Paul Morrissey, with the idea of turning it into a nightclub, the Dome, to host the performances of the exploding plastic Inevitable, what it is going to be known as the Velvet Underground eventually. Warhol himself functioned as the architect under, it was his only work of architecture, under the name and the architect trademark. But only after Warhol did the electric circus become the laboratory for discotecture. It was redesigned by Sharmayev and Geismar as a new multi-sensory venue, with light and sound performances as materials to create a semi-solid environment. Life magazine called the circus a mind bender that combines life and art in a way that has never been done before. The medium, the message, and the audience are all in the same bag. Just calling it audience participation is a flagrant understatement, unquote. This discotecture became so important that when a series of Italian architects and designers like Fabrizio Fiumi came to the United States with the idea of studying Frank Lloyd Wright and American organicism, they changed their minds and decided to dedicate their thesis project at the University of Florence to the Piper or Disco, which launched the careers of Pietro De Rossi and Alessandro Poli and the members of Superstudio, Archithum, that of course all of their first projects were nightclubs. And you could see here some of the Pipers by Pietro De Rossi with the specific equipment made by Bruno Munari in Torino and in Rome. If the disco was the space to gather together different ideas of media and space, then the art scene could not be left behind. For the Palladium, Schreger and Rubel hired Henry Geltzaler, the former curator of 20th century art at the Metropolitan Museum of New York, to curate the artwork for this space. Isozaki remembered that the gallerist Tony Shafrazzi was involved in this selection of artists, like Keith Haring, who painted a mural for the dance floor, Two other murals by Basquiat were also installed. Kenny Scharf decorated the bathroom with his trademark graffiti and stuffed animal work. The bathrooms were absolutely wild, of course. And there were also frescoes by Francesco Clemente, and Isozaki with Clemente here, as well as complimentary drink tickets designed by Andy Warhol himself. During the time that the Palladium operated as a nightclub, Schreger and Rubel programmed continuous exhibitions and events, including a launch party for the opening of the Warhol Basquiat exhibition at Leo Castelli Gallery in 1985. And you can see some of the flyers that were designed from Keith Haring to Barbara Kruger to many different artists. Isozaki was not the only designer of the Palladium environment. As Architectural Record pointed out, perhaps it is inevitable that Japanese architect Arata Isozaki will be credited as the author of the Palladium. Yet to discount the other names in the lengthy credits is to do a disservice to reality. The Palladium is the product of a true multidisciplinary collaboration. The project was also incomplete without its inhabitants, a community of cyborg dancers where the architecture, the light and sound system, and the artworks were an extension of their bodies. This is one of the voguing parties at the Palladium. This synthesis was in Isozaki's mind from the beginning. He said, in a disco, technologies pour over the whole body of a person. It is as if hidden desire is evoked. Rather, it would be better to say that a shower of technologies give birth to successive desires. It offers a possibility of a theophany, revealed in banality of daily life, end quote. The use of technology here was something that went beyond the well-tempered environment. Alongside the controllable aspects of humidity, temperature, light, and sound, the effect of drug use and other chemical regimes, music and interaction with dancing bodies, together built a situation that was not tempered, but was also not perceived as natural. The Palladium was inhabited by narratives, art, architecture, technologies, but ultimately also dancers on the dance floor. Even though the Palladium was far from being radical in the politics of its investors, the community of dancers that populated discotheques in New York promoted a kind of activism embodied in their own performativities. At a time when men-only spaces for dancing were still illegal, and New York legislation required clubs to have at least one woman for every 3 men, the dance floor was a highly contested space. Its main inhabitants were mostly LGBTQIA+ communities, Blacks, Latinos, and women. There were communities that were struggling to develop forms of resistance and empowerment effective in making themselves visible in order to achieve representation in the US democracy of the Nixon years and decades later under Reagan administration. As a result of this process, a collective political intelligence was developed, one that would later be momentous in the generation of coalitions by which these communities responded to the emergence of a crisis like HIV/AIDS during the mid-1980s. For example, the first meetings of gay menstrual crisis were called in the Paradise Garage that habilitated a very specific party like April Showers, or the many parties that are going just like to be held here, where ACT UP, Grand Fury, and some other activist groups are going to spread information on some even treatments or possibilities to face the epidemic in the nightclubs, in the dance floors themselves. During the Palladium's existence, parties were often dedicated to fundraising for these causes. The Art Aid Party, promoted by ACT UP on March 26 in 1986, at which artworks by Cindy Sherman and Ed Ruscha were auctioned, or the Gay Pride Balls, like the one thrown by Steve Cohn in 1986. These inhabitants were as important as the architecture in the configuration of the Palladium. As A+U highlighted at the time, they said, The people, who they were with, and what they wore, and not the architecture, has dominated the press to date. The article continues by describing the Palladium as an organism of hedonistic pleasures, whose heart and brain are the building center. This organism was an event where the architecture itself was performed. In this context, it was not so odd that the Palladium's performative architecture, its discotheque, disappeared when its milieu did, when many of its dancers succumbed to HIV/AIDS and the advances of gentrification in New York City during the late 80s. Without its dancers, the Palladium was just a space, not a discotheque. In 1997, the Palladium was bought by New York University. The building was demolished and replaced by a student dormitory and a gym. Isozaki predicted that the Palladium and all architecture would meet this fate. He said, space equal darkness, time equal termination, and matter or architecture and cities equals ruin and ashes. Thank you.
Wonderful. So from the Palladium and Studio 54, we have to take a pretty big step back in time and in space. Ivan just really suggested how the story, like what is the dark end of the story, right? So we all know that from the 1980s, the HIV/AIDS epidemic really starts to hit New York and the rest of the US, and in particular the communities of people that were the ones who most ardently were making use of such architectures. And still today, I think it might be tempting not to think that the history of HIV/AIDS begins and ends in the nightclubs in New York. After all, this particular geography, as Ivan has powerfully suggested, has dominated the narrative of the disease for so long, right? But a number of recent developments in the medical sciences demand that we take some step backs to the end of the 19th century. So almost 100 years before. So around the 1880s, the global demand for natural rubber had a sudden and unprecedented spike as a consequence of the invention of the vulcanized tire. The Congo Free State was the largest colony in sub-Saharan Africa, and it had been set up in 1885, just on the back of the Berlin Conference, as a personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. The Congo Free State was now the largest source of a plant called Landolphia variensis, which is the wild rubber vine that abounds in the Central African rainforest, but it cannot be planted in captivity. So in 1891, an act of the king declared all the land that was not seen as inhabited or cultivated in European eyes a property of the crown. Once enclosed, the land was distributed to a number of concessionary companies controlled by European investors. Almost overnight, a region 100 times the size of Belgium was turned into an open-air harvesting ground operated with the enslaved labor of the indigenous population. In the 20 years of the Congo Free State, up to 10 million Africans are thought to have died in the violence, starvation, and diseases that ensued the colonial quest for rubber. And we will never know, of course, the right numbers because there were no written records, and whatever records that Belgium had were destroyed as soon as the Congo Free State became a formal colony controlled by the government. So it is in this place at this time that we actually have to look for the origins of HIV, as far as it might seem from the 1980s in New York. So a virus called the simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, begins infecting humans at a rate high enough for the initial epidemic to develop. So using phylogenetic dating, which is a technique that looks at the evolution of the DNA, scientists have recently been able to establish that SIV was transmitted from chimpanzees to humans between 1900 and 1915. We don't know exactly how this happened, and there's not really much point in trying to figure it out, but it is thought that the ecological turmoil that ensued the quest for rubber and the sort of like complete like upset and destruction of pre-existing networks of existing within the tropical forest have altered the equilibrium and the sort of like ecological relationships that were taking place between apes and humans. From the forests of southwest Cameroon, where the first transmission has been located, the first transmission event. And we're really talking about a single event. You know, scientists have been able to point down like to one. It was enough for one successful virus, in other words, right, to actually be passed on for a whole pandemic to develop. So from the forests of southwest Cameroon, the virus followed the newly opened trade routes down the Congo River tributaries. It landed in the early 1920s in Leopoldville, the capital of the colonial state, which had been founded as a trading post by the English explorer Henry Morton Stanley. In Leopoldville, the virus found a habitat suitable to its survival, a large and dense permanent settlement, in contrast with the smaller, mobile pre-colonial agglomerations. And it found a highly unbalanced population composed of European settlers and African workers, with widespread rates of sex work and high rates of sexually transmitted diseases among both groups, so both among the African workers and the European settlers. It is crucial to note here, of course, that both sex work and STDs were completely absent from Central Africa before the colonial period, so they were introduced together with civilization. Strikingly, João Sousa, a Portuguese microbiologist that has reconstructed the story, has found that the beginning of the HIV epidemic in Kinshasa, which was dated to have been taken place between 1919 and 1930, coincides with a spike of syphilis cases, which is visible in colonial records. So it is in this way that the virus, of course undetected and undetectable, started to reproduce and to slowly mutate and adapt to the human body. After the Belgian Congo became independent in 1960, the virus was transported across the Atlantic by Haitian functionaries that were sent by the UN to replace Belgian ones. And from there, let's say, the current pandemic begins. But let's take a step back, actually, and look closely at the architecture of Leopoldville in the crucial years in the 1920s. Because the city was planned so that European dwellings would be located close to the river, which is up in the drawing, with the workers' camps farther inland in what came to be called the Cité Indigène. And you can see like very clearly the difference in urban forms between the European neighborhood, which is this kind of like Parisian, or aspiring to be Parisian set of boulevard and place and squares, and the gridded street plan of the indigenous part of the city. So as the number of workers started to grow, people who were migrating from the forest that was now completely depleted, Europeans became more explicitly concerned with the management of the African population. So after 1915, what had started out as camps were replaced by gridded street plans. And in 1923, European concessionary companies were required to build new houses for their workers. And you see how much the Cité Indigène starts to expand, how quickly it grows. So despite the fact that so-called native areas were deliberately kept semi-rural by the colonizers to distinguish them from the more urban and modern European quarters, the new homes were presented as the civilized and benevolent alternative to traditional African dwellings. So this is a set of photographs that was prepared actually by the Belgian authorities to be shown at an exhibition in the 1950s to show how indeed benevolent they had been in providing new homes. So João Sousa, the scientist, has found out that the main site for casual sexual encounters in Leopoldville was precisely the zone neutre. And here we have to remind of what I was saying before, that somehow sex work is thought to have been the main fact in the spread of the disease. And I would like to stress that we are talking of likely heterosexual sex work. So most of the sexual encounters were taking place in the neutral zone, a strip of empty land that was carved out for hygienic purposes between the European quarters and the Cité Indigène, which you can see here on a map of the city at the time, like just at the right, to the right side, is marked explicitly as a neutral zone, reflecting the European colonial discourse that disguised dispositives of racial segregation under the cover of sanitary measures. In October 1928, the Governor-General of the Belgian Congo had written to the Minister of Colonies recommending the implementation of a neutral zone to separate the black and the whites. This was an urban strategy that had been experimented with success in the point of view of the European planners in French and German colonial cities and was now being applied to the Belgian colonies as well. So, having rapidly become a no man's land, the neutral zone, which was the very urban device designed to protect the health of Europeans, was likely the site that more than any other in the city permitted the ongoing transmission of HIV and its adaptation to the human body, and crucially its survival until today. So the preceding reconstruction is based on the past 10 years of biomedical and genetic research, as well as the opening of the Colonial Archive, which enabled to excavate an archaeology of the virus, and of course to give us a completely different awareness of what the disease, what HIV/AIDS is. Yet the language of science alone is not enough to excavate the implications of the facts that it exposes, because repositioning the origins of AIDS at the site of one of the worst instances of colonial violence demands that we ask, for example, whether epidemics are natural or whether they are in fact human-made or colonial-made. So is a virus that mutated because of a human action natural or artificial? Of course. The global circulation of pathogens had to be reframed then in terms other than a generic threat that comes with contemporary travel, as is often the case in media representations of epidemics. So if you think about the idea that people who move bring disease, right? Then the 1885 Berlin Conference explicitly advocated the principle of free trade. This is something that is often forgotten, but the idea of like free trade, capitalism was really at the heart of the conference, as much as borders were. European nations had to be able to move commodities around Africa as they pleased, including rubber. So the Congo Free State is then the model of an entire territory that was reconfigured solely for the extraction of natural resources and their channeling to Europe. It is the case that imperial networks laid out in the 18th and 19th centuries, combined with the extensive settlement and commodification of wild environments, were taken advantage of by previously localized microbes, which were now free to circulate around the globe. So turning back to architecture, we also need to ask whether the Western city, which is always assumed to be the normal form of urbanization and of living together, was really a way of bringing civilization to the rest of the world, or whether in fact it was a spatial model that might work in the so-called temperate environments, but turned out to be a powerful epidemiological condenser when translated to different ecologies. Because far from being a mark of primitivism, the sparse pre-colonial villages that were reproduced endlessly in the imaginary of like late colonial period were in fact the optimal built form for African societies developed to live in a natural environment as rich in microbial wildlife as the African rainforest is. Because we have to imagine that the biodiversity of the rainforest doesn't only apply to big animals, it also applies to microorganisms. So limiting settlement size and population density in such context was a highly effective way of avoiding the spread of infections. By contrast, the European colonial city can be conceived as an alien ecology, which amplified the pathogens that had been unleashed in the forests. And yet, the recent discovery that HIV originated in sub-Saharan Africa has contributed to furthering the long-entrenched representation of the continent as a dark, savage place, and the equally entrenched representation of infectious diseases as something that belongs solely to the global south, and that might be here just by mistake. Even in the most recent accounts of the history of AIDS, and I've really browsed a lot of them, both in the popular and the medical literature, the colonial context is rarely, if ever, mentioned, relegating the empire to an asterisk, as Christina Sharp so powerfully has put it. The history of HIV suggests that we can then think of an infrastructural unconscious. So infrastructure not only encompasses the material structures of circulation, but also the structures of oppression and exploitations, the relationship across different species, and the microscopic as well as the macroscopic. At the same time as colonial scientists were discovering the existence of bacteria and viruses, and as European planners were concerned with the problem of sanitizing and cleaning up the city, preventing the circulation of unwanted matter and people, other types of matter started to circulate around the world. Like other epidemics, HIV, which is still so painfully with us today, exposes, I think, the irrationality of the roots of the promise of Western modernity to bring order to the rest of the world. I think we can finish it here. Yeah, actually, yes. If there are questions now, we are happy to take them, or maybe to discuss more informally. Yeah. Yep. Later with a beer. Adrian. Yeah.
I wonder, Andrea, what you would make of the kind of reverse traffic of viruses and the way that they're also weaponized by Europeans through the process of colonization.
Yeah.
So things like smallpox and influenza, etc., which are also intentionally used to decimate local populations. It's kind of intentionally.
Yeah, absolutely, no? And I think there's of course like a long history and a long awareness, no, of this process, and the smallpox blankets in North America. Also, I think the whole like what is being called the Columbian Exchange, no? So I think it's really like stimulating, like to think of this exactly like this bidirectionality, I think, of disease, no? So there is. And always, I think, to keep, for me, is important to maybe, and a way to answer the question is to like keep the ecological dimension of the epidemic in the picture, no? So maybe imagining that like certain viruses that were brought to the Americas and decimated the population actually were developed in the ecosystem of the European city, no? Of the overcrowded European city. And again, so somehow how the city always returns in the story, no? So in this case, it's the city again that acts as a sort of like developer, like sort of incubator of viruses. I mean, it's not quite an answer, but it's just like some ways, like exactly like to begin to think of that, I would say.
Is there an actual link between your two discussions? I mean, they're both very interesting, but I'm seeing them as two separate discussions. I was wondering whether at some point whether you discussed how the two might. They're both very interesting, but they're almost two separate discussions, unless you're trying to make I'm interested in why the two of you are discussing, in my mind concurrency, but I'm not quite seeing all link between the two.
I think that for us it was very important to try just like to think HIV/AIDS through unexpected perspectives related to architecture. For us, it was very important, on the one hand, to explain especially this, the impact of colonialism and colonial development at some point in Congo. But for me, it was also very important how to trace back some of the architectures that were actually building up some of the activism during the 1980s in New York that are not very common to be told in this literature dedicated to HIV/AIDS. So both what I'm trying to do, I think, is to show some of these hidden first stories related to HIV/AIDS, but also not how it was shaping how it was affecting the cities, but how the cities at the same time, or the architecture of these cities, so the urban fabric, the urban environment, were shaping the epidemics in themselves and the understandings that we could have, specifically in this case, HIV/AIDS.
I mean, and maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think the point of our work now, which we are very much trying to develop together now, is that if you take an epidemic such as HIV, you can see that the same kind of entity, right, connects two incredibly distant geographies indeed, right? So it's both in the clubs of New York and in the forests of Central Africa. And for us, it's an incredibly stimulating way of thinking about a whole set of questions, modernity, infrastructure, and to rethink all these questions and to, I think, subvert also certain assumptions about architecture as being somehow existing in a void, no? So I think you see how actually, I mean, the whole point of showing my part after Ivan's, is to kind of zoom out of the picture and connect a very urban setting with a much broader ecology. So which is, I think, something that we very much argue for. I think Brendan maybe had a question.
Yes, I had a question. Not related to AIDS, but to the discotecture. I was really struck by the architecture record cover that covers Isazaki. And of course, you mentioned Piper Club, and so my question was really basic, which is just, can you speculate on at what point did discotecture as a project cease to be relevant in the architectural community, or cease to become a brief for architects, and for what reason?
I think that it's really interesting, and the configuration of the nightclubs is going to take place in the 60s and 70s. Before that, for example, and it's with the creation specifically of the figure of the DJ. That before that, there was only a playlist of hits, and people just have to listen to them. But the DJ started an interaction between the dancers and the DJ himself or herself that was playing certain kind of music and trying just to find the response of these kind of dancers. In this kind of interaction, suddenly the configuration of the dance floor, where the DJ is going to be located, and the technologies that are surrounding them are going to gain importance and momentum. For architects, it's quite interesting, and especially during the 60s, nightclubs are going to be places where different social realities, classes, and especially in places like New York, also different identities are going to mingle at some point. But what is interesting is actually to see that this level of interaction and this level of social enthusiasm is going, of course, to gain momentum in the 60s, when some of the architects are going to explore the same in different parts of the definition of the public space, or the definition of art institution, or the definition of what conversation in a city could be, let's say. So it's very interesting that, for example, even in the Fan Palace by Cedric Price, at the very center of it, there is a huge discussion, almost for 20 years, in his plans and with the people that were working at his office, of where they could locate the nightclub inside of the Fan Palace. And again, with Alessandro Poli and all of the Italian architects, it's going to happen the same. At the same time, because it's a kind of architecture that it is rejecting the idea, for example, of the facade, because it's, as you know, for nightclubs, what is typical is the design is in the interior. It's even a kind of an unexpected architecture. Some of the architects involved with it, even Isozaki at some point, are going to see the architecture of nightclubs as something that it is not as respectable in the traditions of architecture as other kind of configurations. And especially with the 80s, I mean, we have to think that one of the first places where HIV/AIDS was located by the medical community, or the places that are going to blame for the spread of the disease, are going to be actually the nightclubs. Yehudi Feldman, Dr. Yehudi Feldman from NYU, published in 1981 that it was a bug that was coming from the pipes out of the nightclubs, and or that it was coming from the poppers that were, of course, use in the dance floor. So at the same time, this idea of the nightclubs as a space of desire or as a space of experimentation is going to die at some point also during the late 80s and 90s, and of course the advances of gentrification. So I think that what I was trying to do also is to make respectable, in a way, the tradition of the nightclubs as spaces for experimentation, actually for architects, and that are going to actually have a very big connection with some of the other projects that they are going to do eventually.
Yes.
I'm thinking of kind of another commonality between the two talks, which is kind of a double-edged sword of liminal spaces or neutral zones, and that kind of in both New York City of the 1970s and colonial Africa, you're seeing a kind of disruption of an existing order. So you could argue that New York is also experiencing a kind of sudden decline of an urban order that had come before the sort of white flight and deindustrialization, oil crisis, and all these things, which actually allowed for potentially the spread of AIDS, but also activism and public, collective engagement. And so, just I wonder if that's a kind of interesting subject that could be taken up in the Congo as well. Is what else might have been happening in the neutral zone?
Yeah. And I think that's a very good point, right? Because I think it's precisely, maybe I should, but I think precisely the idea of like a social order that is in fact extremely fragile, right? And extremely unbalanced in all sorts of ways, demographic, in terms of power, of course, relationships, that of course makes this neutral zone completely, I think, indeterminate space, of course in a very tragic way as well, right? And very extremely violent way. And it's kind of also hard to really just understand what was going on in this kind of sites, because it's not the kind of thing that would be recorded in the colonial archives. So to kind of like go back to it, it's like one has to like just look sideways really, and to like try to think how these like forms of social organization, or like also violent organization bodies, I think, in space was recorded, I think. But I think it's great to actually like think of New York in a way as this kind of wasteland as well, no?
Yeah, absolutely. Nightclubs themselves, because I mean, I think also that is an excellent point in that sense, because disco was not respected at all. I mean, maybe there is like some nostalgia right now, but it was not respected at all. In 1979, there is going to be the Disco Demolition Night in Chicago. There is going to be in this baseball stadium with full of thousands of people that were burning disco albums with claims like disco sucks and other, for example, homophobic or very racist slurs. Because, of course, if you think in the main protagonist of disco music are going to be the disco divas that are also trying to propose other definitions of womanhood. Think, of course, or femininity, or the idea even of a woman. Think of, for example, in people like Grace Jones, that was proposing even a kind of almost post-human in that sense. Yeah. And they are going to be very conscious about these attacks, and they are going to be very conscious also of the political possibilities of it. Of course, it's not a space of, nightclubs were not only a space of happiness, there were also spaces of segregation, and not all of them are going to perform in the same way. Paradise Garage is going to be extremely open. Most of the staff, for example, were African American or Afro-Caribbean or women, but Titi Valente, for example, said that it was impossible to be a DJ at the gallery, because it was like, no, there's no place for a woman DJ. So I think that it's always like, it's always very, there were very contested spaces, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lens of gender, and especially I think the politics of sexual relations is actually a crucial lens, I think, to look throughout the history, the long history of HIV, of course. So from indeed the encounters in a colonial city to these kind of encounters.
I'm wondering whether you would even extend your art. I mean, it sounds crass, but I'm also intrigued by the idea that it ends up being prophylactics themselves that end up arresting, being the most effective form of arresting the spread of HIV. In the first place, you've got that weird, odd irony that in the very place where rubber production started, fact comes out to the whole idea that condoms themselves would be the best way of arresting the disease, where at the point where, you know, in the country where the gender, where the disease.
Of course, the further irony would be that condoms are hardly available in sub-Saharan Africa today, or at least of course their use is still like very much impaired, right? So, so the people keep dying of disease in the place where the rubber was like harvested, right? So I mean, Achille Mbembe was actually pointing this out in relation to another epidemic of Ebola, in which people were dying because there were no gloves in Liberia, which is the country that produces the most rubber in the world, or something like that. All the rubber, of course, goes to Firestone in the US to make tires. I mean, if there are no more questions, we can probably just continue with the drink.
I just thought of the connection between Italy and New York in the 70s, and kind of, I actually didn't know that history either.
Oh yeah, no, that was amazing actually at some point, because they were of course obsessed, and they were coming from Florence with Frank Lloyd Wright and American organicism, and it was just like absolutely by chance that they had a common friend, and they went to the Andy Warhol's factory, and then it was like, what is this place? And they went to Canal Street actually and to Bowery and bought all of these kind of lighting systems that gave to Bruno Morari, and started actually some of the experimentations with them. And it was like, what are we doing with our lives? What are we designing like museums in the gallery of Uffizi in Florence? We should do actually some of these nightclubs. And it was actually quite interesting. Of course, later on is going to be the Grand Domestic Revolution, and some of the new landscapes. The new domestic landscapes exhibition, and some of the other relationships with Italy that are going to be increased actually, and sometimes just like with design, not only with architecture, especially through the figure of, for example, of what's the name, Barbara Darcy, that is going to be in charge of Bloomingdale's design department, and is going to commission, for example, to Gaia Aulenti, Anna Maria Castelli, and then a super young Frank Gehry to do like some of the interiors of these places. And it's going to be like this kind of, there is actually a claim, and it was also like a kind of a brand for disco music, that is Italians do it better. That is going to be almost related to design.
Yeah. We should leave it at that.
Yeah.